Fast and Furious 37% Rotten Tomatoes movie hasn't received much love over the years, but I'll always defend the underrated project. Having debuted over 2 decades ago, Fast and Furious has grown into one of the biggest action franchises of all time, with an incredible box office haul and a number of hit movies. Although Fast X was a box office flop, the saga had a financial hot streak heading into the 10th installment, proving how much it had grown, and despite not always being celebrated by the critics, Fast and Furious has still cemented itself as a cinematic spectacle. Audiences are often split on which movie is the best, as each Fast and Furious film has its own crazy car stunts and memorable fight scenes to admire. However, one film is usually towards the bottom of most people's list, but I think it deserves more credit. Scoring just 37% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, and 50% among audiences, one of the franchise's earliest entries is often panned for its simplistic plot alongside its disconnection from its predecessor, and while these criticisms are definitely valid, the black sheep of the Fast and Furious franchise is still a fun ride. Too Fast Too Furious isn't great, but it's actually enjoyable. The second Fast and Furious installment may be flawed, but there's still a lot to like. I'll be the first to admit that Too Fast Too Furious isn't a cinematic masterpiece, but even if it's not great, the movie is still enjoyable. Paul Walker and Tyrese Gibson made for a fun leading duo and had great chemistry, meaning the cheesy dialogue and bad jokes still worked as Roman and Brian had an authentic friendship in Too Fast Too Furious. Although it leaned into the action elements that ultimately took over the franchise, the plot still stemmed around street racing, which makes it one of the few Fast and Furious films to actually embrace the original premise. Although the movie still has serious aspects, it doesn't lack humorous moments, and I still find myself cracking up at the film, even when it may not be the intention. It also introduced some of Fast and Furious' best characters, as Roman and Tej made their debut in the sequel, proving there was some value that came out of it in the long run. Despite future entries having better stories and more gripping action, there is still a lot to admire about Too Fast Too Furious, and its flaws don't prevent it from being an enjoyable watch. Too Fast Too Furious had a unique charm to it that the Fast saga never recaptured. The movie's simplistic charm was lost as Fast and Furious turned into a mainstream blockbuster franchise. Custom image of Paul Walker as Brian O'Connor and Tyrese Gibson as Roman Pierce in Too Fast Too Furious surrounded by laughing emojis. Custom image by Yailin Chacon. One of Too Fast Too Furious' biggest selling points is its charm, something the rest of the franchise could never quite replicate. Brian and Roman's double act remains one of the best in the entire series, and the straightforward storyline has a lot more charm than the later installments. Whereas future entries involve going into space, driving between skyscrapers, and redirecting missiles, Too Fast Too Furious keeps things simple, which is part of its identity. It may not contain Fast and Furious' most ridiculous stunts, but the characters still feel realistic and somewhat relatable, despite their quirky nature. The newer films undoubtedly have much better action and eye-catching moments, but the characters themselves don't feel as grounded as they do in Too Fast Too Furious. It's hard to deny the franchise's first-ever sequel isn't rough around the edges, but the film's imperfections add to its personality, and I still feel it offers more good than bad. The tone and overall vibe are something that you can't really find anywhere else in the Fast and Furious saga, meaning Too Fast Too Furious will always be one of the most charming movies in the franchise, despite its shortcomings. Fast and Furious major changes since 2003 make Too Fast Too Furious better in hindsight. Too Fast Too Furious is much easier to appreciate after the franchise's huge changes. Given how much the Fast and Furious series has developed over the years, Too Fast Too Furious legacy has only gotten better, not worse. While the films that followed still focused on cars, the franchise slowly moved away from street racing and instead centered more around the characters' criminal elements and their status as outlaws. Too Fast Too Furious also had a heavy crime aspect to it, but the narrative still provided a heavy reminder that Fast and Furious was originally about racing, meaning all the major changes in the last 2 decades only make the sequel better.